They had promised themselves they would never return to that place. Yet there they were, standing in separate cars on the gravel driveway, facing the country house, as if facing a truth they had spent 15 years avoiding. Margaret turned off the engine first. Through the windshield, she could see the same weathered shutters, the same stone path leading to the front door, the same climbing roses that had bloomed wild every summer. Nothing had changed except everything. She had changed. Thomas, she assumed, had changed too. But the house remained frozen, a monument to what they had left unfinished. She watched him through her rearview mirror. He was still sitting in his car, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Neither of them moved. The afternoon light filtered through the oak trees, casting long shadows across the lawn where they had once sat together, talking about futures that never came to pass. Margaret felt her chest tighten. This was a mistake. Coming here was a mistake. But her sister had died, and the will had been clear. The house belonged to both of them now, to Margaret and to Thomas, jointly, absurdly, as if Claire had wanted to force this moment upon them from beyond the grave. Margaret opened the car door. The sound broke the silence, like a stone dropped into still water. She stood slowly, her legs uncertain beneath her. Thomas got out too. They faced each other across the driveway, 20 feet of gravel and 15 years of silence between them. He looked older. His hair had gone grey at the temples. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there before, but his posture was the same, that slight stoop of the shoulders, the way he held his hands in his pockets, as though trying to disappear into himself. Margaret felt something old and sharp move through her chest. She had told herself she was over this, over him, over the summer that had ended too soon and too quietly. But standing there, watching him struggle to meet her eyes, she realized that some feelings do not fade. They simply wait. Margaret had loved this house once. It had belonged to her sister Claire, but Claire had always been generous, insisting that Margaret spend her summers here, bringing friends, bringing boyfriends, treating the place as if it were her own. The house sat on 12 acres of rolling fields in the countryside, far enough from the city to feel like another world entirely. There was a lake beyond the trees, where they had swum as children, a barn that had been converted into a studio where Claire painted, a garden that bloomed in wild profusion every spring. Margaret had spent countless summers here, but the one that mattered, the one that had changed everything, was the summer she turned 32. She had been recovering from a divorce that had left her hollowed out, unsure of who she was outside of the role she had tried so hard to play. Her marriage had not been terrible, just slow and suffocating. A gradual erasure of herself until she woke up one morning and did not recognize the woman in the mirror. The divorce had been quiet, civilized, the kind where lawyers exchanged papers and assets were divided with cold efficiency. But it had left Margaret unmoored, adrift in a life that no longer fit. Claire had been traveling for work that summer, and the house had been empty, waiting. Margaret had planned to stay for 2 weeks. She had stayed for 3 months. She had needed the silence, the space, the permission to simply be without having to perform or pretend or put herself back together for anyone else's comfort. The house had given her that. It had asked nothing of her, demanded nothing, and in that emptiness she had begun to find herself again. Thomas had arrived in July. He was a friend of Claire's husband, an architect taking a sabbatical, looking for a quiet place to work on a project that had been gestating in his mind for years. Claire had offered him the guest cottage on the property, a small stone building near the woods, far enough from the main house to provide solitude but close enough to share meals if he wanted company. Margaret had not expected to like him. She had not expected anything at all. She had been wary of company, protective of her solitude, and the idea of sharing her refuge with a stranger had felt like an intrusion. But Thomas had been different from what she had anticipated. He was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not withdrawn. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words carried weight, as though he had considered them carefully before letting them go. He did not ask her prying questions about her divorce or her life. He did not offer unsolicited advice or try to fix her. He simply existed alongside her, respecting her need for space, while making it clear that his door was open if she wanted company. They had fallen into an easy rhythm almost by accident. Morning coffee on the terrace became a shared ritual. Margaret would wake early, brew a pot, and carry it outside. Thomas would appear a few minutes later, drawn by the smell, and they would sit together watching the mist lift from the fields, saying little, comfortable in the quiet. Then they would go their separate ways. Thomas to his cottage to work on his architectural drawings, Margaret to the garden or the lake, or simply to sit with a book on the porch, letting the hours drift by without purpose or plan. But in the evenings, they would find each other again. Dinners that started as polite gestures became something Margaret looked forward to with an intensity that surprised her. They would cook together, simple meals made from whatever was in the garden or the small market in town. Thomas was meticulous in the kitchen, measuring and timing with the same precision he brought to his work. Margaret was more intuitive, tasting and adjusting, trusting her instincts. They teased each other about it gently, and the teasing felt like a kind of intimacy. After dinner they would talk. Long, winding conversations that wandered from architecture to literature to music to the small, unguarded truths people only share when they feel safe. Thomas told her about growing up in a small town in the Midwest, about his father, who had been a carpenter and had taught him to see the world in terms of structure and line. Margaret told him about her childhood, about Claire and the way they had been inseparable as girls, about the pressure she had felt to be the responsible one, the good daughter, the woman who did everything right. She told him about her marriage, not the details, but the feeling of it, the way she had slowly disappeared inside it, the way she had thought that love meant erasing yourself to fit someone else's expectations. Thomas had listened without judgment, his eyes steady on hers, and when she finished, he had said quietly that he thought she was brave for leaving, that it took more courage to walk away from something that was killing you slowly than to stay and endure it. No one had ever said that to her before. Everyone else had offered sympathy tinged with disapproval, as if divorce was a failure she should be ashamed of. But Thomas had seen it differently, and something in Margaret had shifted, a small door opening in her chest. Margaret had not meant to fall in love with him. She had thought she was done with love, that her capacity for it had been spent, that the divorce had used up whatever reserves she had left. But love, she learned, does not ask for permission. It arrives quietly, settling into the spaces between words, growing in the silences, until one day you realize it has taken root so deeply that removing it would tear you apart. It happened gradually, in increments so small she did not notice until it was too late. The way Thomas smiled when she said something that amused him, a slow spread of warmth that reached his eyes, the way he remembered things she mentioned in passing, small preferences and dislikes, and incorporated them into his gestures without calling attention to it. The way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was not paying attention, with an expression she could not quite read, but that made her heart skip. There were moments when she almost convinced herself she was imagining it, that the connection she felt was one-sided, a product of her loneliness and the strange, suspended quality of that summer. But then there would be another moment that contradicted her doubts, a touch that lasted a fraction too long, a silence that felt weighted with something unspoken, a look that held more than it should. Once they had gone swimming in the lake on a hot afternoon. The water had been cool and clear, and they had floated on their backs, staring up at the sky, talking about nothing and everything. When they emerged, dripping and laughing, Thomas had reached out to brush a strand of wet hair from her face, and his fingers had lingered against her cheek. Margaret had stopped breathing. They had stood there, water pooling at their feet, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, and she had been certain, absolutely certain, that he was going to kiss her. But he had stepped back, clearing his throat, and the moment had passed, leaving Margaret aching and confused. She never told him. There had been moments when she almost did, when the words had gathered in her throat, pressing against her teeth, desperate to be spoken, but fear had held her back. Fear that he did not feel the same. Fear that speaking would shatter the fragile peace they had built. Fear that loving him out loud would ruin everything. And so she had kept silent, hoarding her feelings like a secret waiting for a sign that never came. And then August had ended. Thomas had finished his project, the plans for a community centre he had been designing, and there was no reason for him to stay. Claire and her husband were returning from their travels, and Margaret knew she needed to go back to her own life, to the apartment in the city that still felt foreign and unwelcoming. The last week had been strange, both of them moving around each other with a carefulness that felt like grief. They did not talk about the fact that their time was ending. They did not make plans to stay in touch. It was as if speaking about the future would make it real, and neither of them was ready for that. On the last night, they had dinner on the terrace, as they had done so many times before. The air was warm, the sky streaked with pink and orange as the sun set. Margaret had made pasta, and Thomas had opened a bottle of wine, and they had eaten slowly, drawing out the meal, neither of them wanting it to end. After, they sat in silence, watching the stars appear one by one. Margaret had felt the words building in her chest, the confession she had swallowed all summer rising up like a tide. She had opened her mouth, ready to speak, ready to risk everything. But before she could, Thomas had stood. He had said he should go, that he had an early start in the morning. His voice had been gentle, but final. Margaret had nodded, unable to trust herself to speak. Thomas had hesitated, his hand on the back of his chair, and for a moment she thought he might say something, might offer her the opening she needed. But he had only said good night and thank you, and then he had walked away. Margaret had sat alone on the terrace for hours after, staring at the stars, feeling something inside her break. In the morning, she had woken to find Thomas already gone. No note, no goodbye, just the empty cottage and the silence pressing in. She had left the next day, driving back to the city with tears streaming down her face, hating herself for her cowardice, hating him for his, hating the summer for giving her something beautiful, and then taking it away. She had told herself she would get over it, that it had been nothing more than a summer infatuation, a temporary madness brought on by loneliness and the strange suspended quality of those months. She had been wrong. Thomas had not expected to see her again. When the lawyer had called to inform him of Claire's death and the terms of the will, he had assumed the house would go to Margaret or to Claire's husband, or be sold outright. The idea that Claire had left it to both of them jointly had seemed cruel at first, then oddly fitting. Claire had always seen things others missed. She had a way of understanding people that was both comforting and unnerving. Thomas had liked her immensely, admired her, and when she had offered him the cottage that summer 15 years ago, he had been grateful beyond words. He had been at a crossroads in his life, burned out from years of working in a firm where profit mattered more than design, where every project was a compromise, a watering down of vision to meet budget constraints and client demands. He had needed the space to think, to create without pressure, to remember why he had become an architect in the first place. The cottage had given him that, and Margaret had given him something else, something he had not expected and had not known how to handle. He had noticed her immediately, of course. It would have been impossible not to. She had been beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way, but it was not her looks that had captivated him. It was the sadness that clung to her, the way she moved through the world, as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible. He had recognized it because he had felt it himself, that sense of being unmoored, adrift, searching for solid ground. They had not talked about it at first. They had simply existed in proximity, sharing space without intrusion. But gradually, carefully, they had begun to open up. Thomas had found himself telling her things he had never told anyone, not even his closest friends, about his father's death and the way it had gutted him, about the guilt he carried for not visiting more often in those last years, about the way he sometimes woke in the night, feeling like he was suffocating, crushed under the weight of expectations he could not meet. Margaret had listened without trying to fix him, without offering platitudes or empty reassurances. She had simply held space for his pain, and in doing so, had made it more bearable. And he had done the same for her, listening as she spoke about her marriage, her divorce, the way she had lost herself and was trying to find her way back. The connection between them had grown slowly, imperceptibly, like a vine climbing a wall. Thomas had not meant to fall in love with her. He had not been looking for that. But somewhere between the morning coffees and the evening conversations, between the shared meals and the comfortable silences, it had happened. He had fallen deeply and irrevocably, and the realization had terrified him. Thomas had always been careful with his heart. He had learned early that vulnerability was dangerous, that opening yourself up to someone gave them the power to destroy you. His first serious relationship had ended badly, his girlfriend leaving him for someone else, and the betrayal had left scars that had never fully healed. After that, he had kept his distance, engaging in relationships that were pleasant, but ultimately shallow, never letting anyone get close enough to hurt him. But with Margaret, all his defenses had crumbled. She had slipped past his walls without even trying, and by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. He was in love with her, and he had no idea what to do about it. He had thought about telling her countless times. The words had been there, ready, waiting for the right moment. But every time he came close, fear stopped him. What if she did not feel the same? What if he ruined the fragile friendship they had built? What if she laughed, or worse, pitied him? Margaret was kind to everyone. She had a warmth about her, a generosity of spirit that drew people in. Thomas had seen it in the way she talked to the vendors at the market, the way she greeted the mailman, the way she smiled at strangers. What if what he felt was just her nature, and he was reading too much into it? What if he was projecting his own loneliness onto her, seeing something that was not there? The thought was unbearable, and so he had stayed silent, hoarding his love like a shameful secret, watching her from a distance, and wishing he were braver. That last week had been agony. He had known their time was ending, and the knowledge had sat heavy in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had thought about staying, about finding an excuse to extend his time at the cottage, but that felt pathetic, desperate. He had thought about asking her if she wanted to stay in touch, but the words had felt inadequate, too casual for what he felt. And so he had done nothing. On that last night, when they had sat on the terrace under the stars, he had felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on him. He had looked at Margaret, at the way the candlelight caught in her hair, at the sad smile on her lips, and he had known with absolute certainty that if he did not speak now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He had opened his mouth, the words right there, ready to spill out. But then he had seen the tears in her eyes, the way she was holding herself together with visible effort, and he had lost his nerve. She was already hurting. How could he add to that burden by confessing feelings she might not return? How could he make this about him when she was still healing from her divorce, still piecing herself back together? And so he had stood, had said goodnight, had walked away. He had lain awake all night in the cottage, staring at the ceiling, hating himself. In the morning, He had left before she woke because he could not face her, could not trust himself not to break down and confess everything. He had driven away from that place thinking that distance would help, that time would dull the ache. He had been wrong. The years that followed had been hollow. Thomas had thrown himself into his work, taking on project after project, working 16-hour days, traveling constantly. He had opened his own firm, built a reputation, won awards. From the outside, his life looked successful, enviable even. But inside, he felt like a ghost, going through the motions, never fully present. He dated, of course. There had been women who were smart and beautiful and kind, women who would have been perfect partners for someone else. But Thomas could not give himself to them. He tried, he wanted to, but every relationship ended the same way, with some variation of the same conversation. He was too distant, too closed off, too unavailable emotionally. They were right, he knew. He was those things. Because part of him was still at that house, still sitting on the terrace with Margaret, still caught in the summer that had never really ended for him. He thought about her more often than he should have, wondered where she was, what she was doing, whether she was happy. He had looked her up online once, 5 years after that summer, and had found a photo of her at some professional event. She had been smiling at the camera, poised and elegant, and the sight of her had sent such a sharp pang of longing through him that he had closed the browser immediately and promised himself he would never do it again. It was too painful to see her and not be able to reach out, to know that she was living her life somewhere without him. He had thought, in his weaker moments, about calling her. He had her number, or at least the number she had had back then. He had no idea if it was still current, but even if it was, what would he say? That he had been too much of a coward to tell her he loved her 15 years ago, but he was telling her now. That he had spent a decade and a half regretting his silence, it seemed absurd, pathetic even. And so he had stayed silent, just as he had stayed silent that summer. And the years had continued to pass, each one taking him further from the moment when speaking might have made a difference. When the lawyer called about Claire's death, Thomas had been genuinely shocked. Claire had been in her late 50s, healthy and vibrant the last time he had seen her. A sudden aneurysm, the lawyer had said. She had died instantly, without pain, without warning. The funeral had been small, family only, and Thomas had not been invited. He had not expected to be, but he had sent flowers and a card to Claire's husband expressing his condolences, and he had sat alone in his apartment feeling the weight of loss and the strange, dislocating sensation of time collapsing, and then the lawyer had called again to inform him of the will. The house, the 12 acres, the cottage, all of it left jointly to him and to Margaret, equal shares. The lawyer had seemed puzzled by the arrangement, had mentioned that it was unusual, but that Claire's instructions had been explicit. Thomas had understood immediately. Claire had known. She had seen what he and Margaret had been too blind or too afraid to acknowledge. And now, in death, she was giving them a second chance, or perhaps forcing their hand. Either way, Thomas could not avoid it. He would have to see Margaret again. He would have to face everything he had run from 15 years ago. The thought terrified him. But there was something else there too beneath the fear, a flicker of hope, small and fragile, that maybe it was not too late. Maybe there was still a chance to say the things he should have said all those years ago. Thomas walked slowly toward the front door where Margaret was standing. She was holding a key the lawyer had given her, but her hands were shaking slightly. He noticed and looked away, not wanting to embarrass her. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old wood and something faintly floral, lavender perhaps, from the sachets Claire used to keep in the linen closets. Everything was as Thomas remembered. The wide stone fireplace that dominated the living room, The long wooden table in the dining room where they had shared so many meals, the windows that looked out over the fields, framing the landscape like a series of paintings. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different, because they were different, older, carrying the weight of years and choices and regrets. Margaret moved through the house slowly, touching things lightly, as if reassuring herself that they were real. Her fingers trailed along the back of the sofa, the edge of the mantelpiece, the spines of books on the shelf. Thomas followed at a distance, giving her space, unsure of what to say or how to say it. They had not spoken since that summer. There had been no argument, no dramatic farewell. He had simply left, and she had let him go, and the silence between them had calcified into something heavy and immovable. The silence in the house now was different from the comfortable quiet they had once shared. This silence was taut, vibrating with tension, with all the things that needed to be said and were not being said. Margaret stopped in the kitchen, staring at the old wooden table where they had eaten breakfast together so many mornings. Thomas saw her shoulders tense, saw her take a deep breath as if steadying herself. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the awful quiet, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say that would make this easier? Finally, Margaret turned to face him. Her eyes were dry, but her expression was guarded, careful. She asked if he wanted coffee. Her voice was polite, distant. The voice of someone talking to an acquaintance, not someone she had once shared her deepest thoughts with. Thomas said yes. They moved around the kitchen in a strange, stilted choreography. Margaret filling the kettle, Thomas searching for mugs, neither of them speaking. The coffee brewed, and they took their cups out to the terrace, sitting in the same chairs they had sat in 15 years ago, and the familiarity of it was almost unbearable. They sat in silence, sipping their coffee, staring out at the fields. The weight of the years pressed down on them, all the conversations they had not had, all the questions that had gone unasked. Thomas could feel Margaret's presence beside him like a physical thing, could feel the careful distance she was maintaining. And it hurt more than he had expected. This was worse than not seeing her at all. This was seeing her and being treated like a stranger. After a long moment, Margaret spoke. She said they needed to decide what to do with the house. Her voice was even, practical. They could sell it, she supposed, split the proceeds. It made the most sense, given that neither of them lived here anymore. Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, he said, that made sense. But even as he said it, he felt a sharp pang of loss. Selling the house would mean severing this last connection, closing the door on this chapter of his life permanently. It would mean never having a reason to see Margaret again. The thought was unbearable, but what choice did they have? They sat in silence again, and Thomas felt the moment slipping away, felt the opportunity to speak evaporating like morning mist. He cleared his throat. He asked how she had been. It was an inadequate question, far too small for the gulf of 15 years, but it was all he could manage. Margaret glanced at him, something flickering in her eyes that he could not read. Fine, she said. She had been fine. She worked in publishing now, had moved up to a senior editor position. She had a small apartment in the city, a circle of friends, a life that was quiet but satisfying. She did not mention whether there was anyone special in her life, and Thomas did not ask, afraid of the answer. He told her about his firm, about the projects he had worked on, keeping his tone neutral, professional. He did not mention the loneliness that had followed him through all those years, the way he had never quite managed to build a life that felt full. They were speaking, but they were not really talking. They were skating on the surface, avoiding anything that might crack the ice beneath them. Margaret set down her coffee cup. She said she should probably get settled, pick a room for the night. Thomas agreed. He said he would take the guest cottage. Margaret hesitated, then said the cottage had not been used in years, that it would need airing out, cleaning. He should take the other guest room upstairs. It made sense. It was practical. But there was something in the way she said it, a softness in her voice that made Thomas's chest ache. He agreed, and they went back inside. Margaret showed him to the guest room, a small space at the end of the hall with a window overlooking the garden. She said she would be in her old room if he needed anything, and then she left, closing the door softly behind her. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and wondered how he was going to survive this. Being near her and not being able to touch her, to talk to her the way they used to talk, felt like a special kind of torture. He had thought seeing her again would give him closure, would allow him to finally put that summer to rest. But all it had done was rip open old wounds, making him realize that he had never stopped loving her, that he never would. That night, neither of them slept well. Margaret lay in her old bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. She could hear Thomas moving in the room down the hall, the creak of floorboards, the sound of a window being opened. She closed her eyes and tried to will herself to sleep, but sleep would not come. She kept thinking about that summer, about the way Thomas had looked at her across the dinner table, the way his hand had brushed hers once when they were walking, the way he had smiled when she said something that amused him. She had been so certain back then that he felt something too. But he had left without a word, and she had convinced herself she had been wrong, that she had imagined it, that she had projected her own loneliness onto a man who had simply been kind to her during a difficult time. Now, lying in the dark, she was not so sure. There had been a moment today when they were sitting on the terrace, when she had caught him looking at her. It had only lasted a second before he looked away, but in that second she had seen something in his eyes that looked like pain, like longing, like regret. Or maybe she was imagining it again, seeing what she wanted to see because the alternative was too painful to bear. Margaret turned onto her side, curling into herself. She had spent 15 years building a life without Thomas, convincing herself that she was fine, that she had moved on. But being here, in this house where they had been so happy, where everything had felt possible, she realized that she had been lying to herself. She had not moved on. She had simply learned to live with the ache, to carry it quietly, to not let it show. Downstairs, Thomas stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the moonlit fields. He had given up on sleep an hour ago. His mind would not quiet, would not stop replaying every moment of the day, analyzing every word Margaret had said, every look she had given him, searching for some sign that she felt even a fraction of what he felt. But he had found nothing. She had been polite, distant, treating him like an old acquaintance she had run into unexpectedly. And why would she be otherwise? He had left her without explanation, had let 15 years pass without a word. He had no right to expect anything from her, no right to hope that she might have spent those years thinking about him the way he had thought about her. Thomas leaned his forehead against the cool glass. He was 52 years old enough to know better, old enough to have learned how to protect himself, but standing here in this house, being near Margaret again, all his carefully constructed defenses had crumbled. He felt raw, exposed, vulnerable in a way he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Tomorrow, he thought, they would talk about the logistics. They would make plans to sell the house, to divide everything cleanly, to go their separate ways again. It was the sensible thing to do, the mature thing. And yet the thought of it made him want to put his fist through the window. He did not want to be sensible. He did not want to be mature. He wanted to go upstairs, knock on Margaret's door, and tell her everything he should have told her 15 years ago. But he could not. He had lost that right the moment he had walked away. Morning came slowly, the sky gradually lightening from black to grey to pale blue. Margaret woke to the sound of birds and the cool morning air drifting through her window. She dressed and went downstairs, moving quietly, half hoping Thomas would still be asleep, so she could have a few moments to herself. But he was already in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment their eyes met, and something passed between them, something old and unresolved. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She looked away, busying herself with finding cups, trying to steady her breathing. They took their coffee out to the terrace, just as they had 15 years ago. The ritual of it was almost unbearable in its familiarity. They sat in the same chairs, in the same positions, the morning sun warming their faces. Margaret wrapped her hands around her mug and stared out at the fields. Thomas stood beside her, close but not touching, the space between them charged with everything they had not said. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Margaret wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask him why he had left, why he had never called, why he had let so much time pass. But the words would not come. They stayed locked inside her, heavy and useless. Thomas cleared his throat. He had been thinking, he said carefully, about the house. They needed to decide what to do with it. Sell it, probably. Split the proceeds. It made sense, Margaret nodded. Yes, she said. That made sense. Her voice sounded flat even to her own ears. But neither of them moved. They stood there side by side, drinking their coffee, trapped in the agony of proximity, so close to each other, and yet impossibly far apart. Thomas set down his cup. The sound was loud in the quiet morning. He turned to face her, and Margaret could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. He asked if she remembered that summer. His voice was low, almost hesitant. Margaret felt her heart stutter. Of course she remembered, she said. She remembered everything. Thomas nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see him struggling with something, wrestling with words that would not come. Finally he asked why she had never called him. Margaret's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide. What? Why didn't you ever call me? Thomas repeated, his voice rough. After that summer, you never called, you never wrote. I thought... He stopped, shook his head. I thought maybe it was just me, that I had misread everything. Margaret stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. You left, she said, her voice shaking. You left, Thomas. You didn't say goodbye. You were gone. Thomas closed his eyes. I know. Then how can you ask me why I didn't call? Margaret said, her voice rising despite herself. You made it clear you wanted to leave. You didn't. Her voice broke. You didn't give me any reason to think you wanted to hear from me? Thomas's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the terrace railing, trying to steady himself. I left because I was a coward, he said quietly. I left because I didn't know how to tell you what I felt. I was so sure you didn't feel the same. You were kind to everyone, Margaret. You were warm and open and generous, and I thought maybe that was just who you were. I thought maybe I was imagining that there was something more. Margaret turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You thought you were imagining it. I didn't want to ruin what we had, Thomas said. His voice was hoarse, strained. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable or push you into something you didn't want, so I left. I thought it would be easier. I thought the distance would... He broke off, unable to finish. And did you? Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Did you get over me? Thomas met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw 15 years of longing, of regret, of love that had never died. No, he said. I never did. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and enormous. Margaret felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her, as though everything she had believed about that summer, about Thomas, about herself, had been turned inside out. She had spent 15 years convincing herself that she had been wrong, that what she had felt had been one-sided, and now he was telling her that he had felt it too, that he had loved her and had been too afraid to say it, just as she had been too afraid. The waste of it struck her like a blow. 15 years. 15 years they could have had, if only one of them had been brave enough to speak. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone. Thomas stood too, his expression stricken, as if he thought she was about to leave, to walk away from him the way he had walked away from her. But Margaret did not leave. She turned to face him, her hands trembling, her voice raw. "I loved you," she said. "That summer I loved you so much I could barely breathe. And I thought you didn't feel the same. I thought I was just—" She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to steady herself. "I thought I was just someone you were kind to because you felt sorry for me." Thomas took a step toward her, his face pale. "Margaret, no. God, no, I never—" "You left without saying goodbye," she said, her voice breaking. "You left, and I didn't hear from you. And I had to. I had to make myself believe that it didn't matter, that you didn't matter, because if I let myself believe otherwise, it would have destroyed me." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I should have stayed. I should have been brave enough to—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair, his composure fracturing. "I've regretted it every day since, every single day." Margaret looked at him, at the pain etched into his face, and she felt her anger drain away, leaving only grief. Grief for what they had lost. Grief for the years they had spent apart, loving each other from a distance, too afraid to reach out. She took a shaky breath. "What do we do now?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know." They stood there, facing each other in the morning light, and the silence that had once been comfortable, that had later become tense, now felt unbearable. There was too much between them, too much history, too much hurt. And yet, beneath it all, there was still that old stubborn love waiting. Margaret wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. She felt exhausted, wrung out, and if the weight of 15 years had finally caught up with her all at once. Thomas looked equally spent, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn. They could not keep standing here, she thought. They could not keep circling each other like this, acknowledging the past, but not knowing how to move forward. She needed to sit down, she needed to think. She moved back to her chair and sank into it. Thomas followed, sitting beside her, and for a long moment they simply sat in silence, trying to catch their breath. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Tell me about the years after," she said quietly. "After you left. I need to know. I need to understand." And so Thomas told her. He told her about the years of work, the projects that had consumed him, the relationships that had never worked because he could not give himself fully to someone else when part of him was still here, still caught in that summer. He told her about the loneliness that had followed him, the way he would wake in the middle of the night sometimes and think about her, wonder where she was, what she was doing, whether she ever thought of him. Margaret listened, her heart aching because his story was so similar to her own. She had done the same thing, she realized, thrown herself into work, into the safe, controlled world of books and manuscripts where emotions could be edited and shaped and made sense of. She had dated, too, men who were perfectly nice, perfectly suitable, but none of them had ever felt right. None of them had ever been Thomas. When Thomas finished, Margaret began to talk. She told him about the years after the divorce, about how she had slowly rebuilt herself piece by piece until she felt like a whole person again. She told him about her work, the authors she had nurtured, the books she had helped bring into the world. She told him about her friends, the women who had held her together when she felt like falling apart, who had listened to her talk about a summer 15 years ago and a man she could not forget. She told him about the quiet ache that had lived in her chest, the way she would think of him at unexpected moments, wondering where he was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought of her. She told him about the time she had driven past his firm's office, about sitting in her car across the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, about losing her nerve and driving away. Thomas listened, his eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished, he reached out slowly, carefully, and took her hand. His fingers were warm, his grip firm. Margaret looked down at their joined hands and felt tears prick her eyes. It was such a small thing, this touch, but it felt enormous, a bridge across 15 years of silence. "I'm so sorry," Thomas said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry too," she said. "I should have told you how I felt. I should have asked you to stay." They sat like that for a long time, holding hands, letting the tears come, grieving together for the time they had lost. And slowly, gradually, something began to shift. The anger and hurt began to loosen, replaced by a tentative understanding. They had both been afraid. They had both made mistakes. They had both spent years living with the consequences of their silence. Margaret wiped her eyes with her free hand. She looked at Thomas, at the way the morning light caught in his grey hair, at the lines around his eyes that spoke of years lived, of sorrows carried. "Do you think we're too late?" she asked softly. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know. Maybe. We're not the same people we were 15 years ago. We've lived whole lives apart. We don't really know each other anymore." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "No," she said. "I suppose we don't. But," Thomas said, and his voice was gentler now, "I'd like to. If you'd let me, I'd like to know who you are now, not who you were, who you've become." Margaret's breath caught. She looked at him, at the vulnerability in his eyes, and she felt something crack open inside her. Hope, maybe, or possibility. "I'd like that too," she said. Over the next few days, they fell into a new rhythm. They continued sorting through the house, but the work no longer felt like a task to be completed so they could leave. It felt like an excuse to stay, to spend time together, to learn each other again. They talked more easily now, the initial rawness giving way to something softer. Thomas told her about his projects, about the buildings he had designed, about the ways he had tried to create spaces that felt human, that served the people who used them, rather than just looking impressive. Margaret told him about the book she had worked on, about the thrill of discovering a new voice, about the satisfaction of helping an author shape their vision into something clear and powerful. They were careful with each other, gentle, as if they both understood that this second chance was fragile, that it could shatter if they moved too quickly or pushed too hard. But there were moments when the old ease returned, a shared joke that made them both laugh, a comfortable silence while they worked side by side, the way Thomas made coffee in the morning without asking how she took it, because he still remembered, the way Margaret bought the bread he liked when she went into town for supplies. Small things, but they mattered. They spoke of what had been, those lost 15 years, the choices they had made, the paths they had taken. Thomas admitted that he had looked her up online once, years ago, had seen a photograph of her at some work function, smiling at the camera, and had felt such a sharp pang of longing that he had closed the browser and vowed never to do it again. Margaret confessed that she had driven past his firm's office once when she was in his city for a conference, had sat in her car across the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but had lost her nerve and driven away. They laughed at themselves, at the absurdity of it, two adults pining for each other from a distance, too stubborn or too afraid to close the gap. But beneath the laughter was pain, the recognition of how much time they had wasted. One afternoon, they found themselves in Claire's studio, the converted barn where she had painted. The space was filled with her work, canvases stacked against the walls, half-finished pieces on easels. Margaret moved slowly through the room, studying each painting, seeing her sister in every brushstroke. Claire had painted landscapes mostly, but there was an emotional quality to them, a sense of longing or melancholy that went beyond simple representation. Thomas stood beside her, looking at a painting of the house at sunset. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. She was talented. Margaret nodded, her throat tight. She was. They were silent for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Then Thomas said, "She knew, didn't she? About us?" Margaret glanced at him. "I think so," she said. "Claire always saw things others missed. That's why she left the house to both of us," Thomas said, "to force us to see each other again, to give us another chance." Margaret considered this. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe she just wanted to make sure we had a reason to come back here, to remember." They stood in the quiet studio, surrounded by Claire's work, and Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for her sister, for this gift she had left them, for the opportunity to try again. That evening, after dinner, they walked through the fields as they had done that summer. The air was cool, the sky streaked with pink and gold. Margaret slipped her hand into Thomas's, and he squeezed it gently. They walked in silence, and Margaret thought about how strange it was to be here again, to be with him again after so long. It felt both familiar and entirely new, like coming home to a place that had been renovated in your absence. You recognized it, but it was different now, changed. "Are you afraid?" Thomas asked suddenly. Margaret glanced at him. "Of what?" "Of this," he said, gesturing between them. "Of trying again, of it not working." Margaret considered the question. Yes, she was afraid. She was terrified. What if they had missed their moment? What if the love they had felt 15 years ago could not survive in the present? What if they had built it up in their minds into something it had never really been? What if they tried and failed and had to lose each other all over again? But she was also tired. Tired of running, tired of protecting herself, tired of living half a life because she was too afraid to risk her whole heart. "Yes," she said, "I'm afraid. But I think I'd regret it more if I didn't try." Thomas stopped walking. He turned to face her, his hands coming up to cup her face gently. "I don't want to hurt you again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to fail you." "You won't," Margaret said, though she could not know that for certain. "We won't. We'll figure it out. Together." Thomas leaned down and kissed her gently, tentatively, as if asking permission. Margaret kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. The kiss was nothing like she had imagined all those years ago. It was not passionate or desperate, it was tender, careful, full of promise and fragility. When they pulled apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said quietly. "I never stopped." Margaret closed her eyes, her heart full. "I love you too." They stood there in the fading light, holding each other, and for the first time in 15 years, Margaret felt like she could breathe properly, like some weight she had been carrying had finally been lifted. They stayed at the house for 2 more weeks. They did not talk about what would happen next, where they would go, how they would navigate the logistics of 2 lives that had been built separately. Those conversations would come, Margaret knew, but not yet. For now, they existed in a kind of suspension, a bubble outside of time, where the only thing that mattered was this, being together, learning each other, rebuilding what had been broken. They spent their days working through the house, sorting Claire's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. They found old photo albums, boxes of letters, Claire's journals filled with her thoughts and observations. Reading them felt intrusive at first, but Claire had left instructions in her will that Margaret and Thomas should go through her things together, should take what they wanted. It felt like Claire was still there with them somehow, guiding them, giving them this time together. In the evenings they cooked together, falling back into the old rhythm of the kitchen. Thomas measuring and timing, Margaret tasting and adjusting. They ate on the terrace, watching the sunset, talking about everything and nothing. They talked about their work, their families, the small details of their daily lives. They talked about books and music and art. They talked about their fears and hopes and the ways they had changed. And slowly, gradually, they began to see each other not just as the people they had been 15 years ago, but as the people they were now. Thomas learned that Margaret had become more confident over the years, more sure of herself and her judgments. The tentative, wounded woman he had known that summer had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who had learned to stand up for herself, to ask for what she needed. Margaret learned that Thomas had softened with age, that the careful reserve he had maintained had given way to something more open. He still thought before he spoke, still chose his words carefully, but there was less fear in it now, less worry about being hurt. They were different, yes, but the connection between them, that fundamental recognition of kindred spirits, was still there. If anything, it had deepened, matured, become something richer and more complex. They made love for the first time on a rainy afternoon, in Margaret's old room, with the rain drumming against the windows and the light soft and grey. It was unhurried, almost reverent, as if they were both acutely aware of how precious this was, how easily it could have never happened at all. Thomas traced the lines of her body with his hands, learning her, memorizing her. Margaret ran her fingers through his grey hair, marvelling at the fact that he was here, that he was real, that this was finally happening. Afterward, they lay tangled together. Thomas's hand tracing idle patterns on Margaret's shoulder, Margaret's head resting on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Do you think Claire knew this would happen?" Margaret asked quietly. Thomas was silent for a moment. "I think she hoped," he said finally. "She loved you. She wanted you to be happy." "I am," Margaret said, and realized with some surprise that it was true. She was happy. Not in the uncomplicated, exuberant way of youth, but in the deeper, quieter way that comes with age and experience. She was happy, and she was terrified, and she was hopeful, all at once. The time came eventually to talk about the future. They could not stay in this suspended state forever, could not avoid the practical questions of how to build a life together when they lived in different cities, when they had careers and commitments and responsibilities that could not simply be abandoned. They sat on the terrace one evening after dinner and finally broached the subject. Margaret spoke first. She said she did not want to lose him again, that she could not bear it, but she also did not know how to make this work. Her life was in the city, her job, her friends, everything she had built. Thomas nodded. He understood. His firm was in a different city, 2 hours away. He had clients, projects in progress, employees who depended on him. But he said slowly, he had been thinking. His firm was successful enough now that he could afford to step back a bit, to delegate more, to take on a less demanding role. He could split his time, spend part of the week in the city where his firm was based, part of the week wherever Margaret was. It would not be perfect, but it would be something. Margaret felt a swell of hope. She could do the same, she said. She had seniority at her publishing house, had earned enough goodwill over the years that she could negotiate a more flexible schedule. She could work from home part of the time, could travel to the office when necessary. They could make it work, she said. If they both tried, if they both committed, they could find a way. Thomas reached for her hand. "What about this house?" he asked. "Do we still sell it?" Margaret looked out at the fields, at the garden, at the place where they had found each other twice. "I don't want to," she said. "I know it's impractical, but I don't want to let it go." Thomas smiled. "Neither do I," he admitted. "So we keep it," Margaret said. "We keep it as a place we can come back to, a refuge." Thomas nodded. "Yes," he said, "a refuge." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the stars appear one by one. The future was still uncertain, still full of challenges and complications. But for the first time, Margaret felt like it was a future she wanted to step into. A future that held possibility instead of just obligation. They would figure it out, she thought. They would take it one day at a time, would learn how to navigate the distance and the demands of their separate lives. It would not be easy, but nothing worth having ever was. And this, what they had found here, was worth everything. The next morning, they began the practical work of closing up the house. They cleaned and covered furniture, drained pipes, made sure everything was secure. The lawyer had recommended a property management service that could check on the place periodically, handle any maintenance issues that arose. Margaret and Thomas hired them, relieved to know the house would be cared for even when they were not there. As they worked, Margaret found herself watching Thomas, memorizing the small details. The way he moved through a room, efficient and methodical. The way he hummed under his breath when he was concentrating. The way he looked at her sometimes, as if he still could not quite believe she was real. That this was happening. She felt the same way. There was a fragility to their happiness, a sense that it was too good to be true, that something would come along and take it away. But she was trying to let go of that fear, trying to trust that they could have this, that they deserved this second chance. On their last afternoon, they took one final walk through the fields. The air was warm, the sky a brilliant blue. They walked hand in hand, not talking much, just being together. When they reached the edge of the lake, they stopped. This was where they had swum that summer, where Thomas had almost kissed her and then pulled back. Margaret remembered the moment vividly, the ache of it, the confusion. She glanced at Thomas and saw that he was remembering too. "I should have kissed you that day," he said quietly, "by the lake. I wanted to." Margaret smiled. "I wanted you to." Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious. "I'm not going to make that mistake again," he said. "I'm not going to waste any more time." He pulled her close and kissed her, and this time there was no hesitation, no pulling back. This time there was only certainty, only the solid, grounding knowledge that they had found each other again, and they were not letting go. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Come on," Margaret said, tugging his hand. "We should get back. We have a long drive ahead of us." They walked back to the house together, and as they approached, Margaret felt a pang of sadness. Leaving this place felt like leaving part of herself behind. But Thomas squeezed her hand, as if he could read her thoughts. "We'll come back," he said. "This will always be here waiting for us." Margaret nodded. "Yes," she said, "we'll come back." They loaded their cars, locked the door, and stood for a moment in the driveway looking back at the house one last time. Then, together, they got into their cars. This time, they would not be driving away from each other. Thomas would follow Margaret back to her city. They would have dinner, they would talk about the future, about what it might look like to build a life together after all this time. It would not be easy, Margaret knew. There would be challenges, adjustments, moments of doubt. Long-distance relationships were hard, even for people who had not spent 15 years apart. But they would face it together. And that, she thought, made all the difference. As Margaret pulled out of the driveway, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Thomas was right behind her, his eyes on the road, his expression calm. She smiled. For 15 years, she had carried the weight of what might have been, the ghost of a love that had never been fully realized. It had followed her through relationships and career moves and quiet evenings alone. A constant ache, a reminder of what she had lost. But now, finally, she could let it go, because what might have been was becoming what is. The road ahead of them was uncertain, full of complications and compromises. They would have to navigate the logistics of 2 careers, 2 cities, the practical realities of merging lives that had been built separately. There would be difficult conversations, hard choices, moments when it felt easier to give up than to keep trying. But Margaret was done running. She was done protecting herself at the cost of her own happiness. She had spent 15 years being careful, being safe, and all it had gotten her was loneliness and regret. This time, she was choosing differently. This time, she was choosing love, even with all its risks, even with all its uncertainties. Because love, she had learned, does not wait for the perfect moment. It does not ask for guarantees or promises of forever. It simply asks for courage, for the willingness to be vulnerable, to open your heart even when you are afraid. Thomas had been brave enough to tell her the truth, to admit that he had never stopped loving her, and she had been brave enough to let him in again, to trust that this time would be different. They drove in convoy through the winding country roads, Margaret in front, Thomas following close behind. The landscape rolled by, fields giving way to small towns, then suburbs, then finally the city rising up ahead of them. Margaret's apartment was on the north side, a small one-bedroom in an old building with good light and hardwood floors. She had lived there for 8 years, had made it her own, filled it with books and plants and the kind of comfortable furniture that invited you to curl up and stay a while. She had always liked it, had felt safe there, but she had never quite felt at home. Now, pulling into the parking garage with Thomas following behind her, she wondered how it would feel to share this space with him, even temporarily. They parked and got out, and Thomas looked up at the building, taking it in. "It's nice," he said. Margaret smiled. "It's home," she said. "Or at least, it has been. Come on, I'll show you around." They took the elevator up to her floor, and Margaret unlocked the door, suddenly nervous. What if he did not like it? What if her space felt too small, too cluttered, too much her, and not enough them? But Thomas stepped inside and looked around with genuine interest, taking in the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the cozy reading nook by the window, the framed photographs on the walls. "It's very you," he said, and there was warmth in his voice. Affection. "I like it." Margaret let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Good," she said, "because you'll be spending time here, if that's okay." "More than okay," Thomas said. He crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. "This is good, Margaret. We're going to make this work." Margaret leaned into him, letting herself believe it. "Yes," she said, "we are." Over the following weeks, they began the delicate work of blending their lives. Thomas came to the city every weekend, sometimes staying through Monday or Tuesday if his schedule allowed. Margaret visited him twice, spending long weekends at his place, a modern loft in a converted factory building with high ceilings and huge windows. They learned each other's routines, their quirks and habits. Thomas discovered that Margaret was not a morning person, that she needed at least 2 cups of coffee before she could hold a coherent conversation. Margaret learned that Thomas was meticulous about his workspace, that he could not think clearly if things were disorganized. They had their first argument 3 weeks in, a stupid fight about something inconsequential that spiraled because they were both tired and stressed. Margaret had snapped at him for rearranging her kitchen cabinets without asking. Thomas had retreated into cold silence, the way he always did when he felt criticized. They had gone to bed angry, lying on opposite sides of the bed, not touching. But in the morning, Thomas had apologized. He had said he was sorry for overstepping, that he sometimes got too caught up in making things efficient and forgot that efficiency was not always the point. Margaret had apologized too for snapping, for not just talking to him about it calmly. They had promised to do better, to communicate instead of letting things fester. It was a small thing, that first fight and its resolution, but it mattered. It showed them that they could disagree and still come back together, that conflict did not have to mean the end. They talked about their fears, about the patterns they had learned in previous relationships that they did not want to repeat. Thomas admitted that he tended to shut down when he felt vulnerable, to withdraw rather than engage. Margaret admitted that she had a tendency to over-apologize. to take on more blame than was hers because she was afraid of being abandoned. They promised to watch for these patterns, to call each other out gently when they saw them emerging. It was hard work, this kind of intentional relationship building, but it was also deeply satisfying, knowing that they were creating something solid, something built on honesty and mutual respect rather than fantasy or fear. Margaret's friends were cautiously optimistic when she told them about Thomas. They had heard about him before. Of course, about the summer 15 years ago and the man she had never quite forgotten, but they were protective of her, worried that she was setting herself up for more heartbreak. Margaret understood their concern, but she also knew that this was different. She and Thomas were not the same people they had been back then. They were older, wiser, more aware of what they wanted and what they were willing to work for. Thomas's friends had similar reactions. They were happy for him, but also wary, watching to see if this relationship would follow the same pattern as his previous ones, if he would retreat at the first sign of real intimacy. But as the months passed, they began to see that something had changed in Thomas, that he was more open, more present, more willing to be vulnerable than he had been in years. 6 months in, Thomas proposed that they spend the summer at the country house. His firm had several projects wrapping up, and he could work remotely for a few months. Margaret had accumulated enough vacation time that she could take a leave of absence, could work on a manuscript she had been wanting to edit for ages without the constant interruptions of the office. They talked about it seriously, weighing the pros and cons. Spending that much uninterrupted time together would be a test, would show them whether they could really make a life together or if the magic only worked in small doses. But they decided to try. They arrived at the house in early June, the garden in full bloom, the fields green and lush. Being back felt strange and wonderful at the same time. So much had happened here, so much history, both painful and beautiful. Margaret walked through the rooms, touching things lightly, remembering. Thomas found her in Claire's studio, staring at the paintings. "You okay?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Yeah," she said, "just thinking about Claire, about how she made this possible." Thomas came to stand beside her. "Do you think she'd be happy?" he asked. "About us?" Margaret smiled. "I think she'd be insufferably smug," she said. "And yes, happy, very happy." They settled into the house, each claiming a workspace. Thomas set up in the cottage, which they had cleaned and renovated slightly, updating the plumbing and adding better internet. Margaret took over Claire's studio, surrounding herself with her sister's paintings while she worked on her manuscript. They fell into a rhythm similar to the one they had shared 15 years ago, but richer now, deeper. Morning coffee on the terrace, separate work time, long lunches where they talked about their projects, offering feedback and encouragement, afternoons spent together, walking or swimming or simply sitting in the garden. Dinners that stretched into the evening, conversations that wandered and meandered, touching on everything and nothing. It was a good summer, perhaps the best of Margaret's life. There were challenges, of course, days when they got on each other's nerves, when the constant proximity felt like too much. But they had learned how to navigate that, had learned to ask for space when they needed it, to give each other room to breathe. One evening in late July, they sat on the terrace watching the sunset, glasses of wine in hand. Thomas had been quiet all day, and Margaret had given him space, trusting that he would talk when he was ready. Finally, as the sky turned deep purple and the first stars appeared, he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what comes next, after this summer." Margaret's heart skipped. She had been thinking about it too, had been trying not to let anxiety about the future spoil the present. "What about it?" she asked carefully. Thomas set down his wine glass and turned to face her. "I don't want to go back to the way things were," he said. "The long distance, the weekends, it's better than nothing, but it's not enough. I want more." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "What do you want?" she asked. Thomas took her hand. "I want to live with you," he said, "properly, not just weekends or summer breaks. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build a life together, a real life, not just stolen moments." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I want that too," she whispered. "So let's do it," Thomas said. "Let's figure out how. We can both work remotely, at least part of the time. We could split our time between the city and here, or we could find a new place entirely, somewhere that's ours, not just mine or yours." Margaret thought about it, her mind racing through possibilities. It would mean changes, big ones. She would have to negotiate with her publishing house, would have to be willing to give up some control, some of the career advancement she had worked so hard for. But what was the point of career success if she had no one to share it with? What was the point of building a life if that life left her lonely? "I'll talk to my boss," she said, "about going fully remote, or maybe part-time. I've been there long enough that I have some leverage." Thomas nodded. "I'll do the same with my firm. I can bring in a partner, someone to handle the day-to-day operations. I've been thinking about it anyway." They looked at each other, and Margaret saw her own hope and fear reflected in Thomas's eyes. This was a leap, a real commitment, and there were no guarantees it would work. But that was true of anything worth having, she thought. You had to be willing to risk failure if you wanted a chance at success. "Let's do it," she said. Thomas smiled, and it was the same smile she had fallen in love with 15 years ago, warm and genuine and full of quiet joy. He leaned in and kissed her, soft and sweet. A promise and a beginning. That night, lying in bed with Thomas beside her, Margaret thought about the strange path her life had taken. How she had come to this house 15 years ago, broken and lost, and had found love in the most unexpected place. How she had let fear rob her of that love, had spent years living half a life, going through the motions but never fully present. How Claire's death, as devastating as it had been, had given her a second chance, had forced her to confront what she had lost and decide whether she was brave enough to try again. She was grateful, she realized, for all of it, for the pain and the longing, and even the wasted years, because they had brought her here to this moment, to this man sleeping peacefully beside her. She had learned, finally, that love was not about certainty or guarantees. It was about showing up, about being willing to be vulnerable, about choosing each other again and again, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of contentment and planning. They had long conversations about logistics, about where they would live and how they would structure their work. They decided to keep both of their apartments for now, until they found a place that felt like home to both of them. Margaret talked to her boss, who was surprisingly understanding. The publishing industry was changing, becoming more flexible, and Margaret had proven her value over the years. They worked out an arrangement where she would come into the office 2 days a week and work remotely the rest of the time. Thomas had a harder negotiation with his firm, but eventually brought in a younger architect as a partner, someone he trusted to handle the projects that required his physical presence. It meant less income, less control, but more freedom, more time. In late August, they returned to the city together, this time to Margaret's apartment, which would serve as their primary base for the time being. They spent the fall settling into this new arrangement, learning how to live together full-time, navigating the small adjustments and compromises that came with sharing a space. It was not always easy. There were moments of frustration, times when their different habits and preferences clashed. Margaret liked background noise while she worked, music or podcasts. Thomas needed complete silence. They invested in good headphones. Thomas was a planner, liked to know what was happening days in advance. Margaret was more spontaneous, liked to make decisions on the fly. They learned to compromise, to plan the important things, and leave room for spontaneity in the smaller moments. But more often than not, it was good. Better than good. It was the kind of ordinary, everyday happiness that Margaret had never quite believed was possible for her. Coming home to find Thomas already there, cooking dinner, lazy Sunday mornings spent in bed, reading the paper and drinking coffee, walking through the park together on autumn afternoons, the leaves brilliant red and gold above them. These were the moments Margaret had dreamed of during those 15 years, the simple intimacy of a shared life. And now she had it, and it was better than anything she had imagined. They went back to the country house for Thanksgiving, just the two of them. Margaret cooked, a smaller version of the traditional meal, while Thomas set the table with Claire's good china. They ate on the terrace, despite the chill in the air, bundled in sweaters, watching the sun set over the fields. After dinner, Thomas proposed. It was not elaborate or dramatic. He simply reached across the table, took Margaret's hand, and asked if she would marry him. Margaret said yes without hesitation, without fear, without any of the doubt that had plagued her in the past. They got married in the spring, a small ceremony at the country house with just a handful of close friends and family. Margaret wore a simple dress, cream-coloured and elegant. Thomas wore a suit and could not stop smiling. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising not perfection, but effort, not certainty, but commitment. They promised to choose each other again and again through whatever came. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Margaret's mother developed dementia, and she and Thomas spent 2 difficult years helping to care for her before she passed. Thomas's firm faced financial difficulties during a recession, and there were some lean months where they had to be very careful with money. They talked about having children, but ultimately decided against it. They were both in their 50s now, and while it was not impossible, it did not feel right for them. Instead, they poured their energy into their work, into each other, into creating a life that felt meaningful and full. They traveled, taking trips they had both dreamed of, but never quite managed alone. They spent a month in Italy, wandering through small towns and eating incredible food. They went to Japan, marveling at the temples and gardens. They took a road trip across the United States, staying in small motels and eating at diners, talking for hours as the landscape rolled by. But mostly, they split their time between the city and the country house, the 2 poles of their life together. The city for work and culture and the energy of being around people. The country house for rest and restoration and the deep quiet that allowed them to hear themselves think. Claire's presence was always there, a gentle ghost in the background. They kept her paintings on the walls, her books on the shelves. Margaret thought about her often, wished she could have seen them together, could have known that her meddling, or her gift, or whatever you wanted to call it, had worked. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Margaret with a painting. He had commissioned it from a local artist, working from the photograph they had found in Claire's album that day, the one of them sitting on the terrace 15 years ago, before everything had gone wrong. The painting captured the ease between them, the intimacy, the love that had been there even then, unspoken but real. Margaret cried when she saw it, overcome with gratitude and joy and a sense of rightness she could not quite put into words. They hung it in the living room of the country house, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. Margaret was 60 now, Thomas 62. They were in the gentle slope of later middle age, aware of their mortality in a way they had not been before, but not afraid of it. They had lived full lives, separately and together, and they had learned that time was precious, that it should not be wasted on fear or regret. They had each other, and they had this place, and they had the quiet, deep satisfaction of knowing that they had been brave enough to try again, to risk their hearts one more time. Some mornings, Margaret would wake early and slip out of bed, leaving Thomas sleeping. She would make coffee and carry it out to the terrace, sitting in her usual chair, watching the mist lift from the fields. And she would think about that first summer, about the young woman she had been, heartbroken and lost, and the love she had found and then lost again. She would think about the 15 years of longing, of what-ifs and might-have-beens. And then she would hear Thomas stirring inside, would hear his footsteps coming toward her, and he would appear with his own cup of coffee, settling into the chair beside her without a word. And Margaret would realize that all of it, the pain and the longing and the wasted years, had been worth it to arrive at this moment. Because this was real. This was theirs. This was the life they had built together, against the odds, despite their fears. This was love, mature and tested and true. Some stories do not end the way we expect them to. Some loves are not lost, only delayed, waiting for the right moment to be claimed. Margaret and Thomas had learned this the hard way, had spent 15 years apart before finding their way back to each other. But they had learned it nonetheless, and the lesson had changed them both. If you have ever loved someone in silence, if you have ever let fear keep you from speaking your heart, if you have ever wondered what might have happened if you had been braver, know this: it is never too late to try. It is never too late to reach out, to take the risk, to say the words you have been holding back. Some things are worth the wait. Some people are worth the fear. Margaret and Thomas had wasted 15 years, yes, but they had also been given a second chance. And they had seized it with both hands. They had chosen love over fear, vulnerability over safety, risk over regret. And in doing so, they had found something rare and precious. A love that was all the deeper for having been tested, all the stronger for having survived. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a love you never spoke aloud or a chance you never took, know that you are not alone. We all carry these stories, these what-ifs and might-have-beens, but we do not have to let them define us. We can choose differently. We can be brave. We can reach out. We can try. Your story matters. Your words matter. If this touched something you never said, something you have been carrying in silence, share it in the comments. Let it out. Let it breathe. Sometimes the act of speaking is the first step toward healing, toward possibility, toward the life you have been too afraid to claim.